Every one of us is born into a tribe, a group, into this circle of warmth and meaning. It begins as protection, as story, as a shared gathering around a fire. But sometimes that warmth can blind us. The question isn't whether we should belong or not. It is whether we remember that belonging is an approximation and not the final truth. We need groups. We need tribes. It is how we survive and how we've built all that we have. Some argue that group cohesion led to the rise of language. As people gathered around the fire, they wanted to tell stories. And the rise of language led to the development of our brains, of our minds. So groups are an important heritage that we have. Why do we need them? If we try to break that down to knowledge, action, and will, or awareness, intent, creativeness. In terms of knowledge, the group's narrative is very important. They're a great cognitive tool. They help us understand the world, which is too complex. So groups or tribes give us, through their narratives, approximations that help simplify the world's complexity. Groups' narratives, the group's values. So that's the knowledge function. Work, obviously. Small purposeful communities can drive trust, coordination, creativity through cooperation. This is when they avoid sacred value rigidity and outgroup contempt. Third, in terms of identity, groups and tribes provide social safety. Henry Tajfel talks about that and about instances in which personal self-worth sometimes is derived from group prestige. So tribes have adaptive, evolutionary advantages. They help encode certain survival heuristics. But the question is, what is the dark side of groups? And how do they get derailed from these tools of knowledge, work, identification into enablers of evil, contempt, and cruelty? And I'll mention a few insights from social psychology. One, we don't need a lot of difference to form groups and tribes. The in-group versus the out-group is something that seems to be somehow hard-coded into us. Tajfel talks about minimum group criteria, and he has done some experiments in which he used arbitrary, almost silly criteria to divide people, like which artwork do they prefer, even sometimes based on a coin toss. And it still led to favoritism amongst certain group members. Imagine that. Somebody tells you you belong to a certain group based on a coin toss, and you still find yourself fanatically associated with that silly group. Sharif's experiment, the robber's cave, where he had two groups of children divided and he gave them separate names, some very basic symbolic differentiation, and started giving tasks to the two different groups, and hate, name-calling, abuse started arising. But when he gave them goals that were more common, these things dissolved, shedding the light on how identity can be flexible. There is Jane Elliott's famous experiment in which one day she told blue-eyed children that they were smarter and better, and they started acting arrogantly. And when in another day she told brown-eyed children that they were the ones who were smarter and better, this reversed itself. There's the famous Stanford prison experiment where students were randomly assigned to guards or prisoners, and cruelty erupted. Even though there was this random assignment, the formation of groups hating each other followed. Essentially, it is easy to see why. Hostility and fear are great motivators, and we have this natural tendency to want to belong. But we can look at this escalation ladder. Well, it's not really going up, but to see how groups, tribes, can be derailed from their good, positive, promising, creative objectives of providing knowledge, of facilitating work, of creating meaningful identification into something much darker. So groups provide cognitive shortcuts. They make it easier for us to understand the world, to understand certain problems. But this could lead to moral simplification. Us versus them. We are the good ones, they are the bad ones. And here, the identity heuristic, us versus them, sometimes transforms approximate thoughts into binary groupings, us versus them, moral simplification. This in turn can lead to certain emotional loading, making certain things more emotional than they should be. Because this identification, the moral group that we belong to, can sometimes connect to self-worth. I am worth more because my group, the group to which I belong, the in-group, is prestigious. You can see how perceived threats to the group can be seen even as personal pain sometimes. So from a cognitive shortcut, we move to moral simplification, and then we move to the identity causing emotional loading. This is sometimes coupled by threat inflation, fear narratives, imagined existential threats. Leaders abuse conflation to create a false sense of impending doom. As you said, fear is a great motivator, and I particularly talked about that one in a podcast before. These fear narratives help mobilize people. What also helps within this in-group, out-group logic is the moral disengagement. Bandura talks about how dehumanization can become a license to harm. These others, they're evil, they're monsters, they're I don't know what, they're subhuman or non-human. And so harming them isn't really as bad as you think. Another layer is the institutionalization or the bureaucratization of violence. This is where one person just acts immorally because this is the expectation of their in-group. Hannah Arendt calls this the banality of evil, Eichmann in Jerusalem. And that's the Nazi commander who had the argument that during the Holocaust, he was just doing his job. And at that time, there were all these intelligent and great people around him that didn't think that this was wrong. So why should he think this was wrong? And you see, sometimes groups isolate people. If you're committing a crime, but nobody around you seems to think it's a crime, you don't have access to information that shows you this is a crime, what could you really do? Again, in our time and day, this doesn't work like that because there is much more open access to information. Finally, the mythic closure. This narrative of the group starts as a cognitive shortcut, or that has a most basic function of working as a cognitive shortcut. Once scaled, leads to mythic closure, absolute truth. This can take the form of we are the chosen group. The narrative becomes a myth, and the crime becomes a fulfillment of a sacred script of sorts, an extension of the basic mechanisms of the need for belonging. In-group becomes the absolute truth and the will of God. So starting from cognitive tool, becoming a practical cooperation tool, becoming an identification tool, the group belonging, tribalism, can evolve through these different steps into something very scary. And it is a reflection of the dynamics of approximate thinking, where the incompleteness in our knowledge, the complexity of the world are handled with certain projections, with a creative filling in the blanks. But as we saw before, frequently this creative filling in the blanks involves some tacit interference from the self. Hidden identity variables are projected onto the world. In this case, it is the need for greatness, the need for emotional safety, the need for cognitive closure. And this distorts the group's original function into a web of conflation. What can we do about this? Is it better to just have smaller groups? How about groups with clear goals, practical or intellectual goals? Or can we keep the sacred away from the mundane to avoid these dangers of the group's evils? How can we draw that limit? Frequently, all of this is about the deliberation, the conversation, and remembering that the us in the group is not as homogeneous as someone would have you think. There are different types of us, and it is usually one person's advantage to make us forget these differences. Usually serves some kind of a purpose. Tribalism in general is not evil. It is efficient. It helps. But I frequently can't help but think that many times efficiency without reflection is how approximation turns into an illusion, or even how evil is born. Sometimes it helps to look at the cruelty and who is benefiting from the cruelty. Frequently, the small hater is just a tool that is not very important in somebody else's calculations. Yet it is this small hater who does the killing after getting excited or after getting afraid. And then the big hater will claim that this is not what he meant. The small hater is the one who can activate the machines of prejudice because, quote, it was his job. This is what they asked me to do. Once all of this is seen through the practical lens of approximate thinking, how tribalism and group belonging evolve, once you've understood some of these processes, the group monster hiding in the shadows disappears. Well, actually it appears, and then it can easily dissolve.